I'm going to be talking about work that really is getting underway now, which is looking at varying mental health in the population across Scotland during the recent recession. Quite interesting, isn't it, that several papers we've heard today are thinking about what's been happening during that time when the economy has been plunging. I'd like to acknowledge the input from a whole team of people based here in, I'm also noticing it's very creaky floorboards, so I hope that's not disturbing things too much. Try and stand still. I'd like to acknowledge our team listed here, bringing together people at the University of Edinburgh, University of Durham, and at the University of Newcastle. The next slide, which comes up that way, is the acknowledgements. Obviously, we're the authors of this paper are the ones responsible for our interpretation, but we would like to acknowledge, of course, the help provided by the Longitudinal Studies Centre for Scotland. We also are going to be acknowledging, as I talk, the Electronic Data Research and Innovation Service, IDRIS, the Centre for Research on Environment, Society and Health at the University of Edinburgh, the Administrative Data Research Centre at Edinburgh, the NOMIS group at Durham University, and NHS Scotland. So as Chris mentioned as he introduced me, this is bringing together a lot of different partners, and it shows how the SLS data provides an opportunity for this kind of joint work. The research is supported by the ESRC. More about that in a minute. Celebrating the SLS. This is the last talk in this series, so I'd just like to really underline, as we all, I think, want to, the excellent support that's provided by the SLS team as a whole. I could spend the next 15 minutes just talking about that, but I guess I'd better move on. It's been terrific. The value of SLS data, in this case on self-reported mental health and other factors, for such a large sample covering 5% of the population in Scotland. This is these LS samples are really exceptional, aren't they, across the world, really. We're very fortunate to have them. I'm going to be exploring the potential to combine SLS information with data from other sources, including the IDRIS data on NHS treatment, which I won't say a lot about, but we are developing that as an important part of the research. And also, I'm going to be talking about how we've linked the SLS with data from NOMIS on social and economic conditions and trends. And this is about really an agenda that interests health geographers very much at the moment, which is how we can better explore how changes in places relate to change in health for people. I'm going to be presenting some preliminary findings about how the economic life course of places relates to mental health of residents in different parts of Scotland. And what I'm going to be reporting on is really preparatory work leading up to a successful application to ESRC. I don't know if our ESRC representative is still here. Ah, yes, oh, okay. We're very pleased that this is also funded under the ESRC STAI programme, and we really hope that programme is going to continue because it's very important for the kind of work we've been talking about today. Here's a conceptual framework. Anybody working in mental health will see that I've presented here something which is based essentially on the idea of that wider determinants of health model, which Whitehead and Dahlgren have proselytised all around the world. Here we're looking more particularly at economic and social processes, and the idea is that you have your individual in the middle, the individual and family attributes which represent risks, in this case for mental health. But those are affected by what's happening in the more general local neighbourhood that one is part of, beyond the family. And that, furthermore, beyond that, we have processes which are operating at a wider scale. And here we're interested in trends in the local economy, which operate really beyond the neighbourhood, theoretically. And we're looking to see how all of those might be associated with mental health of individuals, using data from the census and also data on prescribed medicines and treatment for mental health from IDRIS. I'm going to say a bit about capturing area variation in the economic impact of recession. We're using 32 local authority areas in Scotland as proxies for, if you like, the labour market areas. They do actually geographically approximate quite closely to travel to work areas, which are identified by the census. And they're important as well because, of course, these are the units within which healthcare is planned and provided. So they are logically, theoretically, an important geographical unit to consider. We're going to be looking at employment rates since 2007, so as the recession began to bite. We've generalised those into 3-year moving averages to make the data more robust. And these are data which are coming from indicators for local authorities that are provided by the ONS NOMIS Centre at Durham University. We're using group-based trajectory models to generate what you see in the next slide. And the thing I'd like you to just focus on particularly is that there are 4 lines there on the graph, and they're in important colours. Well, actually, they're not symbolically significant, but just bear them in mind for later. There's a group of areas, 9 local authorities in all. It includes Glasgow, where levels of employment have been persistently low throughout this period from 2007 on the left through to 2011. The employment rates didn't change very much in those areas over the period. The red line includes a larger number of 16 local authorities, includes Edinburgh. See how they started off with relatively high employment rates, but they're dropping down as the recession begins to bite, heading down towards the situation in Glasgow and other sorts of areas like that. Then we have a green line, which is representing 5 areas, including Aberdeen, which held up fairly well in terms of employment levels through this period. And at the top, we have 2 areas, Orkney and Shetland Island, where the employment rates are particularly high, have been sustained at quite a high level, although they began to fall back. So, given that groups of local authorities varied in level of employment since 2007, in other words, maybe the recession hasn't had an even impact right across the country in Scotland, and we see some areas with a steeper decline in employment than others. Were those important in terms of mental health inequalities? I don't really have time to go into all the literature which makes us think that conditions in labour markets are important for mental health, but we could maybe come back to it at the end. Many people here will understand that theoretically the stressors of difficulties in labour market can be important for mental health, we think. Here we're exploring it in more detail. We've linked those data on employment trends to the Scottish longitudinal study and in this case I'm going to be talking about linkage by place of residence in 2011. So really the fundamental question is, do those trajectories predict mental illness if we look at the places where people were living in 2011? The mental health data, which I'm mainly going to talk about now, actually comes from as a census question on self-reported health. A lot of you know the census very well. You recognise this question. Do you have any of the following conditions which have lasted or expected to last at least 12 months? And one of the options was a mental health condition. So we're looking here at people that said yes to this question in 2011. This is a brief note about the sorts of analysis which we're taking forward. We're using multi-level logistic regression on individual SLS members. I'm going to be talking about the population aged 16 to 59 years in 2001. So these are people essentially of working age through the recession. The dependent variable that I'm mainly going to talk about is that self-reported mental illness variable. And our analyses control for a number of individual attributes which we know from other research relate to mental health. That includes sex, age group, social class. We've controlled for whether or not they were unemployed by 2011. We control for marital status and whether they were living alone, things about support in the family. And we are also, which is also important, controlling for local neighbourhood deprivation using the Carstairs index at the beginning of the period. So we're trying to control for what would have been local area differences, socio-economic inequalities in this analysis to see whether the broader trends in the economy are important. And we're looking to see whether the employment trajectories I showed you are important for the mental health variable. I'm not going to talk a lot about prescription data today. Our funding for the ESRC project, I'm very pleased to say, will be starting very soon. What I'm essentially providing you with today are preliminary analyses because we've been preparing the ground, and we hope to have quite a lot more to say in relation to the prescription data as the work proceeds. But just a point to make that this self-reported mental health variable does relate quite strongly to prescription of medicines during this period. So self-reported mental illness clearly relates to what is medically recognisable as a mental health condition, although only a minority of those prescribed antidepressants reported a mental illness in the census in 2011. I'm just going to present one result. As I say, we're still producing, getting underway with our analysis, but here's a result that is piquing our interest. So you can see that the blue horizontal line is representing the odds of mental illness associated with those trajectories, and is representing the situation in the blue areas, which you remember included Glasgow and some of the areas surrounding it. So we're looking at how the other groups of areas compare. And you can see that there's a pretty much a gradient with a reducing risk across the other categories. It's interesting for us that the red group, do you remember that started quite high and then went down, is actually not statistically significantly lower. It's somewhat lower, but not a very strong difference. The green and the yellow-orange areas, which you remember were maintaining higher rates of employment throughout the period, are significantly, do have significantly lower risk, and that's especially true for Orkney and Shetland. So we don't have all the answers for this yet. You might be able to suggest some more that we should explore. Be very glad of your ideas. It does begin to make me wonder whether, rather than concentrating on the Glasgow effect, we ought to be concentrating, and Chris and Tom, who I think is in the audience, have been telling me this already, maybe we should be concentrating more on the Highland and Island effect, which is a positive thing. Maybe we just got a little bit obsessed with the, with the negative. What's happening in those more remote areas? But the main conclusions then are, I haven't shown you all the detail, but there are a range of personal, family and neighbourhood factors which are associated with mental illness. All of those control variables I showed you do have a bearing on the outcome. But allowing for all of those, where employment rates remained higher during the recession, people had a lower risk of reporting mental illness. Areas with the better employment rates were particularly in the Highlands and Islands. That pattern might have existed prior to the recession. Our work on prescription data on migration, residential migration, may help us to tease this out a bit more. So there's more work in progress, really, to understand whether that's really an effect that's set in during the recession. Policy implications. We can't really make recommendations for policy yet. We don't have all our results. But the health policies in Scotland do emphasise the importance of maintaining mental health services across Scotland during the recession, and we're exploring what the evidence is that that is important, particularly to control inequality. And if mental health does seem consistently better in the Highlands and Islands rather than in southern Scotland, what might be the implications for targeting resources and development of preventive as well as treatment services? We note, and we've had some very helpful advice from our colleagues in NHS Scotland, that they've produced a report. It's about good mental health for all. It recommended that we strengthen information systems, evidence and research, and greater exploration and use of national and local data is something that they want to see. So we hope that we are addressing that agenda. We're looking forward. One of the great things about the OSRC funding we have is that that's going to help us to liaise with them through our advisory groups as we progress the work.
I'd just like to then close, but close with some thanks. So thanks to everybody for coming, obviously. But of course, these events don't happen on their own. And there's been lots of people involved, but particularly Lee and Angela at the back have been particularly central to making this great event happen. So could we thank those?